Welcome, brave souls, to another journey into the dark corners of Britain's haunted history. Tonight, we explore tales that have sent shivers down spines for generations. Stories of cursed objects, unexplainable phenomena, and terrifying consequences. As you listen, remember that these stories are not just the stuff of legend. They are rooted in real places, real events, and perhaps real hauntings. Settle in by the fire and prepare for an evening of chilling encounters. The night is still, but don't be fooled, something stirs in the shadows. 3 spine-chilling stories await you, but beware, what you're about to hear might leave you questioning the safety of your own home. So settle in by the fire and listen closely. The Devil's Footprints. It was the coldest winter Devon had seen in years. The night of February 8, 1855, was a night like any other. Silent, still, with a blanket of thick snow covering the countryside. The small villages of South Devon slept soundly, their fires extinguished, their doors tightly shut. But when the dawn broke, the peaceful white snow revealed something far more sinister. At first, the villagers thought nothing of the strange marks. They were small, hoof-like, no more than 4 inches long, pressed deep into the snow. But something about them was wrong. They marched in a single, perfect line. No signs of dragging, no variation in the spacing, as if whatever had made them move with impossible precision. More unsettling was the fact that the prints seemed to defy logic, leading over walls, across rooftops, and even through gardens enclosed by fences that no living creature could have crossed. Panic began to spread as the villagers traced the prints for miles, an unbroken line stretching farther than any animal could travel in a single night. Some claimed the prints continued for over 100 miles, winding through multiple villages, crisscrossing rivers and valleys. No explanation could account for it. How could a creature leave such a trail, crossing such treacherous terrain, all in one night? As the villagers gathered, whispering in hushed tones, fear began to take hold. "It's a sign," some said. "A bad omen." Others, braver at first, dismissed the prints as the work of a deer or a goat until they saw where the trail led next, over the rooftops of houses and barns, moving as if the creature could simply walk on air. An eerie silence fell over the village, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the trees. Farmers and townsfolk alike were gripped by an unshakable dread. The footprints seemed to mock them, as if the creature had passed through their homes unseen, yet left behind its chilling mark. And always, always, the trail continued in that same perfect line, never wavering, never faltering. The prints became the talk of the region. Clergy, scientists, and scholars alike travelled to Devon, desperate to make sense of the bizarre phenomenon. Some suggested it was a freak weather event, a strange combination of temperature and snowfall. Others argued it must have been an animal. But what kind of animal could walk for over 100 miles in a single night, leaving no other trace of its passage? But as the investigation deepened, the villagers began to speak in darker tones. Old stories resurfaced, whispers of strange creatures that roamed the moors at night, of dark spirits that could take the form of animals. And then the rumours began. It wasn't just an animal. It was the devil himself. The devil's footprints, they called them, hoof prints, as if made by some demonic creature walking the earth in the dead of night. But why? Why now? And what could it want? Fear gripped the villages more tightly with each passing day. People refused to leave their homes after dark. Doors were bolted, windows were shuttered, but the sense of unease could not be shaken. The prints were everywhere, on rooftops, crossing gardens, passing straight through locked gates. It was as if whatever made them could slip through the very fabric of the world itself, moving unseen, unchallenged. For days, the strange cloven prints remained, etched into the snow as a haunting reminder of that cold winter night. No matter how far they travelled, they always led back to the village, back to the people who had seen them first. Was it a message? A warning? As the days went on, stories spread of strange occurrences. Dogs barking at nothing, shadows moving in the corners of the eye, cold draughts sweeping through homes despite the warmth of the fire. Villagers began to speak of feeling watched, a sense of eyes upon them when no one was there. The snow kept falling, but the prints never seemed to be covered, always there, lingering. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the prints vanished. The snow melted, the cold receded, and with it the footprints faded from the land. But the fear remained. No explanation was ever found. No creature came forward. No rational theory could explain the marks. The cloven prints of the devil, the villagers said, had left their mark on the earth. But the story doesn't end there. Even now some say the prints have appeared again on lonely stretches of moorland in the quiet corners of forgotten villages. They appear without warning, a reminder that something far darker may be walking among us, something that leaves no trace, but fear in its wake. So the next time you see footprints in the snow, stop and look closer. Is it just an animal? Or has something far more sinister left its mark in the night? The screaming skull of Bettiscombe Manor. Nestled deep within the rolling hills of Dorset stands Bettiscombe Manor, an ancient house whose grand appearance belies the dark, terrifying secret hidden within. For generations, the people who lived there spoke of strange occurrences, of eerie noises that echoed through the halls in the dead of night. But none of them dared to speak too loudly, for they all knew that something far more sinister lurked within the walls of the manor. A skull. Not just any skull, but one with a curse. A curse so powerful, so terrifying that to disturb it meant inviting disaster and horror. The story of the screaming skull began centuries ago, with the arrival of a man from far away, a servant brought back from the West Indies by the then owner of Bettiscombe. The servant fell ill and, as he lay on his deathbed, made a strange and desperate request. He begged his master to return his body to his homeland for a proper burial. But in those days, such a request was an inconvenience. The master refused, telling the dying man that his remains would stay in England, buried in the local graveyard like all others. As the man's breath grew shallow, his eyes filled with fear. He made one final vow, a chilling promise. If his body was not returned, his spirit would never rest. Instead, it would scream forever. The servant died that night, his eyes wide open, his body stiff with tension. He was buried, as his master had decreed, in the cold, hard earth of the local cemetery. The house returned to its usual quiet, and the master gave little thought to the servant's dying words. But that peace was short-lived. It began slowly, at first just the occasional noise. A creak of the floorboards, the sound of footsteps pacing the halls at night. But soon the noises grew louder. They became more frequent, more disturbing. Strange, eerie cries could be heard in the distance, growing louder with each passing night. The servants whispered of hearing a voice filled with pain and anger, echoing through the manor's dark corridors. And then the screaming began. It wasn't just a scream, it was a wail. A high-pitched, agonizing cry that seemed to pierce the very air itself. The sound would rise and fall, filling every room of the house so loud that no one could sleep. It was said to be the voice of the dead servant, tormented in his grave, his spirit unable to rest. His promise had come true. He would scream until his body was returned home. Desperate to end the torment, the master ordered the body to be exhumed from the graveyard. But when they opened the coffin, there was no body, only a single skull yellowed with age. The skull was brought back to Bettiscombe Manor and placed inside the house in the hopes that its presence would calm the restless spirit. But the screaming did not stop. The wails continued, louder now, more insistent, as if the skull itself was crying out in agony. The residents of the manor were driven mad by the noise. Some fled in terror, unable to endure another night of the piercing, unnatural cries. Others tried to move the skull, hoping to silence it once and for all, but every attempt to remove the skull was met with disaster. The cries would only grow louder, more furious, as if the spirit was warning them not to touch what they did not understand. One brave soul, determined to be rid of the skull's curse, took it far from the manor, burying it in a distant field. But that night the screams were louder than ever before. They echoed not just through Bettiscombe Manor, but throughout the entire village, filling the air with a sound so terrible, so unearthly, that people miles away could hear it. The ground itself seemed to tremble under the force of the cries. In desperation, the skull was dug up and returned to the manor, placed carefully in a corner where it has remained ever since. From that day forward, no one has dared to move it again. Visitors to Bettiscombe Manor speak of the skull in hushed tones. Many say they can feel its presence as soon as they enter the house, a cold, oppressive atmosphere that settles in the air like a thick fog. Some claim to have seen the skull shift on its own, its hollow eye sockets watching, waiting, and still others say that on the darkest nights, if you stand close enough, you can hear the faint echo of screams, soft, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of a spirit trapped in eternal torment. But there is more to the story, a lingering mystery that has never been solved. Some believe the skull is not that of a servant at all, but of something much older, much darker. There are those who claim that the skull is cursed not just by the restless soul of a man, but by an ancient force, tied to the land itself that preys on those who disturb it. For generations, the skull has remained at Bettiscombe Manor, its power undiminished by time. No one dares to move it, to touch it, or even to look at it too closely, for to do so would be to invite the curse back into the world, and to hear once again the terrible endless screams that haunt the manor to this day. The cursed oak chair of Busby Stoop Inn. In the heart of North Yorkshire, along a quiet stretch of road, lies the Busby Stoop Inn. To those passing by, it looks like any other country inn, warm, inviting, a place for travellers to rest and share a drink by the fire. But for those who know its dark history, the inn carries a chilling secret, a secret tied to an old oak chair, cursed by the rage of a dying man. The story begins in the late 17th century when Thomas Busby, a man with a temper as black as his soul, was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of his father-in-law. The details of the murder are hazy, lost to time. But one thing is certain: Busby had been consumed by anger. It is said that his father-in-law had threatened to take Busby's wife away, and in a fit of drunken fury, Busby bludgeoned the man to death. After his arrest, Busby was taken to the local jail, where he awaited his execution by hanging. But before he was dragged to the gallows, he made one final request: to have a last meal at his favourite inn, the Busby Stoop. His request was granted, and Busby was taken to the inn under guard. As he sat in his favourite chair, an old sturdy oak chair by the fire, he finished his meal and stood to face his captors. With his last breath of freedom, Busby uttered a chilling curse. He swore that anyone who sat in his chair would meet a violent, untimely death. At the time, no one thought much of Busby's words. He was, after all, a condemned man, his threats nothing more than the ramblings of a doomed soul. But as Busby was led to the gallows and hanged for his crime, his curse lingered in the air, waiting and watching. For many years after Busby's death, the chair remained in the inn untouched. It was just another piece of furniture, or so it seemed. But then the deaths began. The first incident came in the early 18th century. A young man passing through the village stopped at the Busby Stoop Inn for a drink. He sat in the oak chair by the fire, unaware of the curse. Hours later, he was found dead, his body crushed in a freak accident involving a carriage. The locals whispered that Busby's curse had claimed its first victim. As the years went on, more deaths followed. Every time someone sat in Busby's chair, tragedy would strike soon after. Some died in accidents, falls from great heights, sudden collisions, or mysterious drownings. Others succumbed to illness with no apparent cause, and always the same chair was involved. One story tells of two airmen during World War II who stopped at the inn for a drink. They sat in Busby's chair, laughing at the old legend as nothing more than a superstition. But just hours later, their car crashed into a tree, killing them both instantly. Another tale speaks of a builder who, after a long day of work, sat down in the chair to rest his weary bones. He joked about the curse, scoffing at the idea that a piece of furniture could bring death. That very evening, he fell from the roof of the building he was working on, his body crushed by the fall. The inn's owners grew increasingly uneasy. It seemed that Busby's curse was not just a story, but a dark reality. They tried to remove the chair, but strange accidents always seemed to follow. In one case, the chair was moved to a storeroom, away from the public. But the very next day, the innkeeper's son who had touched the chair was found dead in a river. The fear surrounding the chair grew. People refused to sit in it, avoiding it at all costs. Some even claimed that the chair moved on its own, shifting slightly when no one was looking. Others spoke of a cold presence that seemed to linger around the chair, as if the spirit of Thomas Busby was still watching over it, ensuring that his curse would not be broken. Finally, in the 1970s, the chair was removed from the inn for good. It was donated to a local museum where it was hung high on the wall, out of reach of any living soul. Even now it remains there, suspended in the air, a silent reminder of the curse that claimed so many lives. No one dares to sit in it, no one dares to touch it. The museum staff leave it alone, wary of the dark power that seems to cling to the wood. But still, the legend endures. Those who visit the museum speak of an eerie feeling in the air, a sense that they are being watched. Some claim to hear faint whispers in the distance, as if Busby himself is still there, waiting for the next foolhardy soul to test the curse. Others say that the chair even now has not lost its power, that should anyone sit in it, Busby's final wish would come true once again. So, the next time you find yourself in an old inn, be careful where you sit. Some chairs carry more than just memory. They carry death itself. 3 cursed objects, 3 terrifying tales, each a reminder that the past never truly lets go. The devil's footprints, the screaming skull, and the cursed chair of Busby Stoop Inn may seem like stories from a distant time, but their echoes still resonate today. They are a testament to the power of fear and the danger of what we do not understand. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're brave enough to return, be sure to subscribe for more chilling stories from Britain's haunted past. And remember, some legends, once disturbed, can never be forgotten.